All right. With all of that said, let's go ahead and transition to something that I know is going to be really, really fun.
Yeah, no cynicism for this conversation here.
Yeah. Our best picture movie series. We are continuing that. As we noted up at the top of the show, we are beginning the 1960s. Over the next 10 weeks, we are going to be covering The Apartment, West Side Story, Lawrence of Arabia. My God, that's a hell of a triple bill. Tom Jones, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music, A Man for All Seasons, In the Heat of the Night, Oliver, and Midnight Cowboy. All right.
This will be interesting.
This is going to be fun.
Yeah.
This is going to be real fun.
I think unlike the 40s, JD, I don't know if this is the same case for you, but the majority of these winners I have seen before. So this will be nice refreshes in many ways. There's only a handful here that I haven't seen before, such as A Man for All Seasons, Oliver I haven't seen before. I actually have never seen In the Heat of the Night before, which will be a really interesting first-time watch for me. But the rest of these I've seen. The rest of these I've seen at least once. So, yeah, this is going to be a fun one.
This is going to be a fun one. I am very much looking forward to it. I can already tell already, as we noted at the beginning of the show, it's going to be very different from the 1940s, which I very much did enjoy. But yeah, the 1960s, a very different flavor of movies here. Before we get into The Apartment real quick, I think this was a rewatch for both of us, correct?
It was, yeah. I've seen this. Okay. I think rewatching it in preparation for this review we're about to have, this may have been like my 10th time seeing this movie. I've seen this movie a lot.
I have seen it a few times as well. However, I did not catch up with The Apartment until maybe COVID. It might have been 2020 during the COVID bubble.
Okay, interesting.
Where I caught up with The Apartment, yeah. So I am relatively fresh on it.
Okay.
But I have seen it several times in the years between COVID and now.
Yeah, which just goes to show how rewatchable the film is.
Yes. And unlike some of these other years, the other four films it was up against, The Alamo, Elmer Gantry, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Sons and Lovers, The Sundowners, I haven't seen those films at all. And except there's one exception. I was trying to find time to watch a few others leading to this because I knew this was on the horizon. Yeah. I did see The Alamo a few weeks ago. That is a bad movie. That is not good, like at all. And
I wonder how much of a trend that's going to be, because with regard to the 1950s and 60s, I wouldn't be surprised if many of these that did go on to win Best Picture were probably among the right ones, we'll simply say.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any of these movies nominated alongside The Apartment. But when we get to, let's say, West Side Story and Lawrence of Arabia, and maybe even My Fair Lady, for instance, a lot of the movies they were nominated against, I have seen, which will make those conversations pretty interesting as to whether we feel like the movie that did win was the right one. And I think that'll be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, once we get to some of these other years, I will have much more context to this. 1960 is one of those where I've seen The Apartment, and that's it. As far as the nominees go for Best Picture, that is anyway.
Sure.
But yeah, The Alamo, not great. That was the Amelia Perez of its time, we shall say. Oh boy.
Okay, well now I know to skip it.
Yes. But The Apartment, let's get into that one. Obviously, it wins for Best Picture in 1960. It was also nominated for Best Director, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, Best Actress. What else? Best Screenplay, Art Direction for Black and White Films, Cinematography for Black and White Films, Best Film Editing, and Best Sound. And it won 5 Oscars.
Yeah, it won. It won Best Picture. It won Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Art Direction and Film Editing.
So it had a really great night. at the Oscars. Really, really great night. And if
Yeah.
the Alamo is indicative of its competition, can totally see why.
Hmm.
But again, I haven't seen the other films. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So with that said, The Apartment. Are you ready to get into this? Is there any other context you want to lay out here before we get going here?
I don't think so. We could at least. I'm sure we're going to talk about Billy Wilder as a filmmaker because
Yeah,
he
I'm
is
sure.
arguably
Yeah.
one of the most influential and notorious filmmakers of all time. You look at the films that he has made; he's got at least like 10 to 11 classics under his belt. The
Mhm.
man is one of the greats for a reason.
He is one of the greats. Absolutely.
Mhm.
He's legendary filmmaker for sure.
Yeah.
All right. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into this. The Apartment, of course, is directed by Billy Wilder, written by Wilder alongside I.A.L. Diamond. It stars Jack Lemmon, Shirley MacLaine, Fred McCurry, Ray Walston, Eddie Adams, and the list goes on and on. All right, Brendan. I guess I should note the synopsis here, although I think we all
Yeah,
know.
I
We all
think
know this
everyone
movie, but
listening
just
has
in
probably
case,
been, aware of this movie for some time.
a Manhattan insurance clerk tries to rise in his company by letting its executives use his apartment for these extracurricular activities, we shall say. But office politics and his own romantic hopes complicate matters. All right, let's get into this, Brendan. What did you think about The Apartment?
There's a lot about this movie that I feel like sets itself apart from some of the other greats of its time. I think this is a great movie. I think it might be Billy Wilder's masterpiece. For me, it's either between this or maybe Double Indemnity. Those are the two films of his that I think I like the most. I haven't seen all of his films, but from those I have seen, those are the two that stick out for me personally. But The
Those
Apartment
two.
is,
Wow.
yeah. The Apartment is probably his most rewatchable. And there are two things about it that I really thought about as I was rewatching it for this conversation we're about to have. One of them just being it might be one of the greatest premises to a movie ever. I just think the premise itself is so clever that it was enough to maybe justify its best writing win at the Oscars. It's a really cool idea, and thankfully the movie itself takes advantage of that cool idea, so it's not just a superficial cool idea without anything to back it up. I think it has a lot to say about the transition of corporate America and the dark underbelly of it, right? That makes the film feel very timely nowadays for sure. The other quality about the film that I really latched onto for this rewatch, it certainly goes hand in hand with some of these other nominations the film received back in 1961. Also, winning for best art direction, for best film editing. It was also nominated for cinematography. Billy Wilder also winning for best direction, because this is a film that's, for lack of a better term, rather domesticated, I guess. Most of it takes place in indoors in maybe 3 different locations: a giant office building, an apartment, the titular apartment,
Yeah.
and maybe a bar. Like, that's really all it is. Very, very much of it is taking place indoors, not really all that exterior. And yet the film has a real epic feel to it. It kind of feels huge. It really takes advantage of the New York City grandness to almost make it feel like a character in its own right. And I love movies that do that. And it's so interesting to see a movie that mostly takes place indoors and almost has this like stagey quality. You can easily see this on a stage, and I think it could actually work as a stage play if you were to adapt it in that way. But it has a real epic feel to it that I guess always knew was there, but I just found myself thinking about that more in the context of, I guess, my film critic mind nowadays. And I was really taken aback by Bill Wilder's direction. I think it's a really well-made film. Like I said, it's one of my favorites of his, but I think it might be his best directed film of all of his directorial efforts. It just has such a precision and such a tonal balancing act going on too that we'll certainly talk about as well. I do quite love this one.
Yep, I am with you. I absolutely love this film. It is an all-timer for a reason, and not just for Best Picture winners, but generally speaking, this is one of the best movies ever made. Wilder's screenplay is extraordinary. It is truly, truly transcendent, partially because it almost feels like a movie that was made for today. We are
Sure.
65 years removed from its release, but its depiction of toxic masculinity and power dynamics with how it exhibits the behavior of these men is sadly very reflective of 2025 given our current sociopolitical climate. There will probably always be a timeless quality to this film regarding its commentary, but in the context of 2025, it hits even harder.
Hmm.
That aside, though, Wilder's writing here as a movie is a masterclass. The dialogue
Oh yeah.
is crackling. There is a poetry to it. There's a sophistication to how each character is written with exquisite purpose. They all have their own unique personalities. Of course, the performances are crucial to that as well.
Hmm.
There's great attention to detail with its tension and drama and balancing that with its humor. It's an astonishing screenplay. But Wilder, the director, to your point, Brennan, is equally vital here because this is a film that should not work. It shouldn't.
It's a fair
In the
point.
hands of a lot of other filmmakers, this would have been a complete and total disaster because the back half of this film does get quite dire with its stakes. For a
Hmm.
film that is sizzling with great humor and playful commentary, things take a drastic turn at one point, and if not for Wilder's sharp control of this film tonally, it would have fallen apart. As great as the screenplay is here, this is equally as much a masterclass in tone management. I don't know how he does it, but the film is somehow able to be extremely entertaining and maintaining its witty levity as its drama becomes deeply poignant. Not enough can be said about the marriage of Wilder's writing and direction here. It is really,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
incredible. And to that point, Brendan, perhaps that's why this is his directorial achievement.
Yeah.
This cast is really excellent. I'm sure we'll talk more about these
Hmm.
performances as this conversation goes, but I have to shout out one performance here. I felt in this on this watch especially. I've always loved the performance,
Hmm.
but Shirley MacLaine on this rewatch for me hit quite deeply for me. And I think
Hmm.
it's
I agree.
because we are off the heels some months ago where on the In Film Awards I talked about Connie Kuzruti
Yeah.
in All We Imagine Is Light. And I talked about in that review that we did for that film and on the award show how I fell in love with that character. I just wanted to give her a hug and tell her that everything was going to be okay. I had that conversation, that feeling that I had of Connie Kuzruti with McLean in this film as well.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
just fall in love with her. You want to wrap your arms around her and let her know that it's going to be okay. Like your heart just completely breaks for her. It's such a stunning performance. And I know this is hyperbole. I just watched this the other night. So maybe take this with a grain of salt. And this might change the next time we bring up a Wilder film. I don't know. I think it might be my favorite performance in a Billy Wilder film. It might
I
be.
would not push back on that. Maybe the only other performance I might cite that could still be in that conversation is maybe Ray Milland from The Lost Weekend. Um,
Yeah.
uh, or I'm looking at his filmography here. Maybe Gloria Swanson from Sunset Boulevard is another one I might think about as well.
Mhm.
But I certainly wouldn't push back on the notion that Shirley MacLaine gives the best performance in a Billy Wilder film.
Mhm.
I could potentially agree with that. I wouldn't be surprised if Connie Cruz Rudy would cite her as an influence, given her
Mhm.
performance in All We Imagine Is Light, because I actually think there are some silent comparisons that could be made between both performances. You're right; she's a very huggable character,
Mhm.
and I
Yeah.
love her here so much.
Yeah. I mean, there were a couple of lines here where I nearly fell out of my seat
Hmm.
when she responds to Bud at one point, and he denotes that her mirror is broken on
Mm-hmm.
the little mirror that she carries around.
Mm-hmm.
And she says to him, I like that it's broken. It makes me look the way that I feel. Oh my God.
That is a line. That is a
Oh my
line right
God.
there.
That is killer. That is like you just fall out of your chair like, oh
Well,
my God. Like your heart just burst into a million pieces, especially
yeah.
like the line itself, again, going back to the writing, is extraordinary. But the way she delivers that line takes it to a new stratosphere. It is an
Well,
absolutely just devastating line delivery.
yeah, well, this is why we have to once again praise Billy Wilder, the director, and his tone management here. Because a line like that in any other filmmaker's hands that maybe doesn't have that type of precision or that type of skill they would probably overemphasize the drama of that line to the point that it maybe
Mm-hmm.
felt a little saccharine, a little too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Billy Wilder doesn't quite do that. I think that's why the shift at the midpoint here works so well because in many ways, this is a movie that is a tale of two halves. We often talk about that concept, movies that function like a tale of two halves. It might even be a fun separate conversation we can have on this show at some point about the best movies that feel like they are tales of two halves because there's this
Yeah.
clear midpoint shift where the movie takes a turn and becomes something else entirely. But Billy Wilder doesn't overemphasize either the biting satire of the first half and the heavy drama of the second half. He keeps things uh, uh, pretty centralized in a way. He doesn't amp it up too much, which I think allows that transition to feel as smooth as it does. So even though there is an obvious shift, it never feels that obvious. The
Mm-hmm.
film, in a weird way, feels like it's still building to some type of big, crucial emotional turning point that when it comes, you're not prepared for what's about to happen, but you're prepared for some type of shoe to drop. And I think that's what's so great about Billy Wilder, the director here. He does some weird, tricky things that kind of foreshadows something is about to happen pretty soon. And it does. He absolutely handles that very well without overemphasizing either side of that of that agenda, I guess. So it's really well balanced in that regard.
I completely agree. Like I said in my opening thoughts, his tonal control of this film should be studied
Mhm.
and has been studied.
Yeah,
To
there's
be
a.
fair,
My,
people have
the first time I saw this movie was in a film class, so it
yeah,
just goes to show.
exactly. Film classes love breaking down this film, and for good reason.
Mhm.
And it is incredible the conviction of this film in terms of its themes, but so much of the film is playful and diverting in its approach to examining those ideas here.
Mhm.
And it brings life to these characters for sure and injects the film with an incredible vigor.
Yeah.
And then it takes this remarkable turn with Fran that, to your point, the film does set up quite well in terms of how she is a victim of this system that has been created at the workplace
Mhm.
and how she's been caught up in it. Certainly, some of it is her own doings, right? The
Yeah.
choices that she makes in it all.
She
But that's
acknowledges that she
something
always finds bad men. Yeah, she talks about
she
that. Yeah.
acknowledges it. Absolutely. She
Yeah.
takes responsibility of it. And that is such a big part of not just her identity, but her overwhelming sense of insecurity. There's another striking line. And I think it's another moment when she's talking with Bud where
Mhm.
she simply looks into the mirror and he's trying to tell her how he feels. And she just says, I don't like myself. I don't like myself.
What does
And
she say around that time
again,
too? Why do people have to love people or something like that? It's like
yeah,
I mean, you can
yeah.
quote her lines and just write them down,
She,
and you've got it's what a
oh, it's,
screenplay here.
and the writing again, it is really quite poignant, but the
Mhm.
way Shirley MacLaine delivers those lines and how she taps into that deep insecurity and those vulnerabilities in Fran and why she's feeling so down, it is phenomenal acting. And it's really terrific, and it gives credence to the choice that Fran ultimately makes.
Mhm.
And that whole sequence when Bud realizes what's at play. And again, you talk about a moment of tone management. I was talking earlier in terms of the broad tone management of this film.
Sure.
That sequence in and of itself is incredible because Bud, who has another woman over that he had picked up at a bar reluctantly,
Hmm.
has her over, realizes, and obviously we're in full spoilers here, I guess.
Oh yeah,
Spoiler alert.
talking about a
I mean, it's-
65-year-old movie. I think we're
exactly.
okay to get into this.
Yeah. Realizes that Fran is there on the bed, has OD'd on the sleeping pills, and he has to get this woman to leave. And the movie, the way that Bud is trying to get her out of the apartment, it is still somewhat comical. There's
Yeah.
still kind of this diverting quality to him trying to get her out of the apartment frantically and with urgency.
I love how he comes to in a way like he's clearly not sober in the moment, and yet this
Yes.
huge rude awakening sobers him up, which is probably what would happen in real
Yes.
life, and the film emphasizes that too. But you're right, there is still something kind of I don't want to say goofy, but there's still a comedic energy to the way some of these
yes. There is like a comedic edge to it for sure.
Mhm.
And then once he and so then he's able to kick her out. He goes, of course, and runs over to his neighbor, Dr. Dreyfus, to come over to help with the search situation. And he's in the room with Fran. So like as he leaves, or as the woman leaves, and the film is kind of shifting between dire urgency and comedic, please get out of the apartment. Then it shifts totally to the stakes of the moment. And I gotta say, Jack Crucian's his nomination, I think, was for this moment alone.
Oh, it's an inspired nomination. I
is
really think it's one of the most
phenomenal.
inspired nominations in a movie that I've ever seen as far as an acting performance is
Yes,
concerned.
like it's like I hate to kind of phrase it this way because it makes it sound less serious than what the moment really calls for, but it's kind of how you feel, at least how I felt anyway. Because as Dr. Dreyfus is, getting her to vomit, trying to get her to be awake, giving her the coffee, we got to get her up and get her walking. And in Crucian's performance, there's such an emphasis in the urgency in his performance that it almost feels superhero like. Like it's like
applaudable.
I felt like,
Yeah.
like the way you feel about Cap saying Avengers Assemble, that's how I felt about this guy getting Fran to wake up and we gotta
Yeah.
walk. And it is a literal heroic moment in a film that you did not see that coming. Like
Well-
you don't necessarily expect that given the levity and the diverting qualities of the film. And man, it just incredible. Like I wanted to stand up and applaud and cheer and put my fist in the air. Like it's that, like he evokes that despite that sounding like I'm not trying to conflate superhero movies with this film, but
I mean, this is a
it
real
does
superhero
kind
right
of-
here.
yeah, but it does kind of rouse a similar sensation, if that makes sense.
It's kind of like maybe this decade's version of from the 1940s. I'm going to break that marriage up from the best years of our lives.
Okay, I have a comment about that later as well.
Okay.
We're going to circle back to that.
We're
here
gonna
in a
circle back to
moment,
that.
but-
Okay, sounds great. But let's keep talking about Jack Crucian for a little bit because I agree with everything that you're
Yeah.
saying, and I do think it's a very inspired nomination. In any other year, I feel like if we were to get a movie like this and it were to receive a Best Actor nomination, a Best Actress nomination, and a Best Supporting Actor nomination, most likely that supporting actor nomination would have gone to maybe Fred McMurray, who is, Sheldrake, the villain of sorts here, right? And I think he's great here. Don't get me wrong. If he were to if he
He's
were to
very
be
good,
nominated as well, I wouldn't push back on that. But I feel like those three would have been the most stereotypical nominations for a movie like this in years past. And when I say years past, I mean pre-1960s. But this is maybe something we might notice with the 1960s, and maybe why we chose to go with the 1960s for this series next, is that it feels like this is when maybe the Academy was turning a new leaf and changing a little bit in the way that they honored certain films that were maybe a bit more bold and daring, and I think this is a great reflection of that. Jack Crucian is a very inspired nomination because when he takes over in that scene, he kind of becomes the star of the movie for a moment.
He
I was
does.
very I
Very
was
much
very
so. Yeah.
surprised at how, and I've always known this about the movie, but I was very surprised at how much this film really relishes in the medical procedural elements of that scene.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be a weird comparison because they're not the same, but I think the overall agenda is kind of the same. It kind of reminded me of what Spielberg did in a movie like E.T., where he cast real life doctors to try to resuscitate E.T. in that moment. So there's actually some weird grounded realism to it, and it really relishes in that for what feels like a long period of time. The same thing kind of happens here.
Can I speak to that for a moment
Yeah.
specifically? I think what's really fantastic. So like when she's laying there on the bed and he has to give her an injection, you see him, even though the camera is sort of emphasizing Bud in the moment and his panic, you do see Dreyfuss go through the procedural element, to your point, of getting out the needle, putting in the medicine, and going through the whole thing, even putting the needle up to her skin as he's about to inject it for real. And then the camera pans because they weren't actually going to inject the needle into her arm. But like at the last second, the very last second, it pans over to Bud, who is full on panicking in the moment, which I thought was a fascinating little trick to get around that. But everything up to that
give it a visceral
was,
quality to it that it still maintains. Yeah, it seems as though Billy Wilder and Jack Crucian, whoever was involved in this particular scene, they clearly did their medical research. I assume that they did. They had to have consulted. It does feel that way, and I don't know how true that might be, but just based on pure speculation, I think it's safe to assume that they did their research to get that scene as accurate as possible. And that's why I made the comparison to something like E.T., because it did feel very natural and real. And this does feel that way. And it's a long sequence. It goes on for what is essential. I think it's like 20 minutes. Like the whole resuscitation process of Miss Kubelik takes a long time. It's kind of its own mini short film in a way.
It really is. Yeah. It really, really is. Again, quite dire, tonally very different from the rest of the movie, but works. It somehow very much works. And what's interesting about it in terms of the medical procedure of it all that you're talking about, it's also reflective of the time. I think doctors today might look back at that and go, man, that is not at all what you're supposed to do.
We get it, yeah.
For 1960, it probably was how they would have responded to that situation. And I love the conviction. That's the word that comes to mind for me with Dr. Dreyfuss. The urgency, a passionate neighbor who is trying to help out Bud, despite some of the verbal sparring they have throughout the film, because he's constantly giving Bud a hard time or telling him he needs to slow down because his life is spiraling out of control. Now, some of that is he doesn't fully grasp what is really happening in the apartment. However, he did somewhat foresee this happening. Yeah. And that circles back to what you said earlier in terms of the foreshadowing of the film that we get in the screenplay, as Dreyfuss did say to Bud he needs to slow down or he's going to experience something tragic. And then he does. It's just not with Bud, it's with this young woman. And he just jumps into the fray. Like Dr. Dreyfuss jumps in with full conviction to help Fran recover from ODing there. And it is an incredibly visceral moment. Like just one of those great performances that stand out. Like as much as I love Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine, and they very much do shine in this film. They're both freaking fantastic. But man, Jack Crucian, when he is there, when he's on camera, he's noticeable in a big, big way. He's noticeable. So I do love that nomination as well.
It's so a movie's absolutely working when this might be my favorite Jack Lemmon performance that I've seen, and yet it might be the third best performance in this movie.
Honestly. And that's probably how I would rank it. Like I probably would have him at third, and he's really great. He is very, very good. But yeah, I would definitely have MacLaine and crucian over him here.
Yeah, but I
Uh,
do at least want to acknowledge how great Jack Lemmon is here. We haven't really talked much about him yet, because in many ways the film's tonal shift that happens at the midpoint is because of how great his performance is. In many ways, the shift in his performance in particular is the most jarring thing about that tonal shift, but it's what makes that transition more noticeable and seamless in many ways. When he notices the broken mirror at the office party and is able to put two and two together, that the woman he is falling for is the one that he set up his boss with at his apartment. So like the realization there is kind of devastating. And I think Jack Lemmon sells that really well. His interest and attachment to Miss Kubelik is very charming. It really is. And I think a lot of that is also due to how great the cinematography and Bill Wilder's direction is here. There were a few instances from a cinematography standpoint that I really took notice of during this rewatch that I never really picked up on before. And this is why I called the film kind of epic in its own way. Probably my favorite shot of the movie is when Jack Lemmon is standing outside the theater where they're about to play The Music Man, and he's waiting for Miss Kubelik, who said that she would join him.
Yeah.
And at one point, he's the last one standing there. There's no one else around. They've all gone inside to see this show. And this shot clearly emphasizes that it's raining out. But what does he choose to do? He doesn't stand underneath the marquee to keep dry. He's standing in the rain. Just a small gesture like that of how desperate he feels looking out for this person that he wants to spend time with. He is willing to stand as far out as he can just to hopefully catch a glimpse of where she is. And just for lack of a pun intended, I guess, just soaking in that, I think, is really quite great from a cinematography standpoint. I think his performance is also great, parallel to that as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's also a good transition to perhaps talking about the film thematically, because a lot of his performance drives this duality that we see in the character as it relates to the film's themes. And I do agree with you. I think what's fascinating is that while he's certainly a significant cog in the machine as far as the power dynamics go at his company, he's not explicitly involved or the same kind of person as the other men are. And
yeah, he's very innocent by comparison.
He's very innocent, and it starts with that first moment between the two of them, when, at least that we see, obviously they've been working together for a long time, but the first moment that we see them together, Bud walks into Fran's elevator and he takes off his hat and they have an earnest, sincere, charming little conversation there, right? And you juxtapose that to how others treat her in the film, and it is clear that Bud is different than everyone else, but he is also a big part of what's happening there. So like it's fascinating to see that duality, and in Lemmon's performance, how he has to wrestle with that dichotomy, I think is incredible. And it certainly makes sense of scenes like the one that you're talking about, where he is desperate to find, romance in a different way than his superiors are, for sure. Especially as it relates to Fran. And the irony of why she isn't there is, again, part of the brilliance of the writing and the screenplay. And how that moment also kind of colludes with, another scene where he's stuck outside and he has to sleep outside in the cold. And there's like a significant chunk of this film, like 20 minutes, where he has this cold and has to perform as if he has a cold. And the way he moves, the way he sounds is very different than how he is throughout a lot of the film. And like that manic energy from the character doesn't really dissolve, but it does kind of dictate certain choices that the character makes. And again, it adds to the levity and the comedy of the film, right? Like there's a visual gag here where he's like stuffing his nose with medicine throughout a lot of the film.
Oh yeah, his comedic timing's great. But he's just so likable. He's so likable
He's
here
very
from
lovable,
beginning. But there's almost like I think the best word is innocent. Once again, I don't want to say buffoonery or cartoonishness, even though maybe his comedic nature is certainly more heightened than anyone else in the movie. But it's interesting because Jack Lemmon was born in 1925, so he was maybe 35 when this movie came out. But he seems younger by comparison to the way the other men, and he is younger. You know, he is one of the younger members of this firm, and you know, as he promotes himself up through the ranks in a very tricky way, which is again a very clever way of saying how we actually have to progress upward in corporate America, not based on actual talent, but based on, you know, evilness in a way, right? Grossness, toxic masculinity, as you talked about. Yet he still seems awfully younger than he actually is. There's something so innocent and almost childlike about him, which is why I think, in a way, this almost kind of functions like this weird coming of age tale for him, just given the realization and the arc that he has to make when it comes to the film's climax, which I think is very striking.
I agree. I love the performance. I think it tethers to the themes of the film extremely, extremely well. And I do want to talk about that further because I love how this film sinks its teeth into that thematic undercurrent. Again, while being diverting and charming all the way throughout. There is obviously a grossness to how easily these men succumb to infidelity. But
Yeah.
what's really striking is how brazen they are about it. So a moment ago, we were
Yeah.
talking about the innocence of Bud here.
Yeah.
There's a scene where one of the managers, Al Kirkby, gets off the elevator, and what does he do? He
Yeah.
smacks Fran right in the rear,
Yep.
in front of everybody, out in the open. They also talk openly of pursuing other women in the office. They don't seem
Yeah.
to really care about the consequences at all. And these are all married guys. And what I love about Wilder's filmmaking is that he doesn't overplay his cards. He often lets the absurdity speak for itself. The way these managers casually ask for Bud's key as if it was just another office supply, I think underscores how deeply ingrained the corruption is at this firm. But the brilliance of the film is that it doesn't just satirically expose the abhorrent behavior of these men, but it forces Bud to confront a system that he was complicit in creating, a system that rewards power over principle, a system that exiled him from his own life. Instead of taking refuge in his warm apartment after work, he often has to wait outside in the cold or walk the streets.
Yeah.
Again, I love how playful Wilder is with that here. There is a lot of fun to be had with the film as it examines these ideas, but it does denote that, to your point, the game isn't about how good you are, but what you're willing to give up in order to grease the right palms and eventually climb the ladder.
Yeah.
And if that's not the story of America, I don't know what is.
Well,
That
and
is
yeah.
100% what America is all
Well,
about.
and I think what makes this movie so ageless in many ways goes back to that tonal management that we keep referencing with Billy Wilder's direction, is that he obviously takes that notion very seriously, but he doesn't take it too seriously, which I really like,
Yeah.
because there is this balance between kind of a comedic nature and how these men clearly take advantage of Bud just for their own gains, and they're so self-aware of that. There is kind of a silliness in the way that they behave, but it also still maintains that grossness. It does have it both ways and doesn't overemphasize one over the other to play its hand too obviously, even though it is very clear. But it takes a really good director and, of course, some really great actors to find that line where you're grossed out by what you're seeing, yet you still enjoy what you're seeing. Like, there's still something fun about it, and not fun in a way that supports that kind of decision or that kind of action, but it's an enjoyable watch because there is this levity to it simultaneously.
Yeah.
And I love that
Yeah.
balance.
Which Scorsese is very good at, for example.
Oh, of course,
Right.
yeah.
He's the master of it in many ways as well. But Billy Wilder was good at this as well. And what I love about the film is that, and it's challenging to articulate because you are talking about how this film doesn't take itself too seriously. And I do agree that the film is able to maintain its diverting quality while still engaging with these dire circumstances that come about with Fran,
Sure.
as we noted earlier, and its thematic underbelly, as we're talking about here. And the thing about it is, I think Wilder gets to have his cake and eat it too, in the sense
Absolutely.
that I do think that the film takes its commentary seriously.
Hmm.
It just doesn't deliver it in a serious tone all
That's
of
the
the
thing.
time.
That's the thing.
Yeah,
There's conviction in what it wants to say. It clearly has its heart in the right place and is dedicated to saying the right thing, and it feels committed to that. But the delivery of it isn't overly serious.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the two elements that really strike me in terms of the film and like sticking the landing, so to speak, one of them is the Fran stuff, as we talked about earlier, and what happens
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
her. However, I also think about the ending to this film, the third act, where that takes Bud here.
Hmm.
Eventually, there is a line to be drawn in the sand for him once
Yeah.
he realizes how deep the consequences truly are. And what I love about the ending of the film and the choices that Bud makes is that it's not just about giving up what he's gained with his complicity, but
Hmm.
it's about reclaiming some sort of integrity in a world that otherwise treats it as expendable.
Yeah.
And that, I think, also has conviction here. Again, the delivery system, even in those final scenes, there's still a playful quality to it at times. But I think,
Hmm.
as far as the thematic underbelly of the film goes, exposing these men for who they really are, I think the film does that in a really fantastic way. So, like, again, and we talked about this earlier with
Hmm.
Lemon's performance and how he taps into this duality. He is complicit and
Yeah.
he has to confront that,
Yeah. He's
which he
aware.
does. And I
Yeah.
love that it gets to a point where he does draw a line in the
You
sand.
know. Yeah.
I don't I don't want to be this person. I am not you, and I want to treat Fran with some sort of respectability and love. And when he realizes that he's not going to get that opportunity because of his boss and who he is,
Hmm.
he makes a decision and just simply walks away from it all. And so,
Yeah.
like, I do love that from a metaphorical perspective as well. I think is really great, and I think that's why
Yeah.
so much of this film is timeless. So, like, it does have a backbone. This is a film with a deep, vigorous backbone, but it does deliver that commentary in just
Yeah.
in such an engaging way that makes this film endlessly rewatchable.
I think what's so ironic about all that too is while we seem to agree on this that the film is taking its themes very seriously, even if it's not presenting them in the most self-serious of ways, it also seems to be the thing that Billy Wilder is most interested in when we get to the ending of the movie is
Yeah,
that thematic conviction, uh,
yeah,
because the movie concludes in a way that this might sound like a backhanded compliment in a way, but I found the ending kind of anticlimactic. But I actually mean that as a compliment. It
yeah.
doesn't resolve,
Same.
yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't resolve in a way that maybe a more traditional movie like this would, because first off, Wilder is more interested in that thematic idea than he is crystallizing the central romance here. I mean, aside from one minor gesture at the apartment when Fran's brother-in-law punches Bud in the face, she
Hmm.
kisses him on the forehead. There's
Yep.
no other kiss in this movie. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
end that way. It ends with a gesture of love, but it ends over a card game, not about the physicality of love.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as interested in that kinship in the most literal of ways. So it actually makes the love between them more, I guess, thematic and a way to parallel those thematic notions we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
And on top of that, characters like Sheldrake, the villain here that we talked about, Fred McMurray, does he really learn anything by the end? Not
No,
really.
not at all.
No.
He's he's a total sleazeball. Even
Yeah.
as consequences come to his doorstep,
Hmm.
and he is forced into a completely new life. And at one
Hmm.
point, we even get a snapshot of his life at home. We don't ever see his wife, I don't think, but we do
Once
see his
she
two
comes
boys.
down the stairs, she does.
Oh,
She
she
does
comes
show
from
up
okay.
once. But
No, that's right. That's right.
yeah,
Yeah.
interestingly about that, as much as we're not supposed to like this man, and we don't. I mean, he seems like a good dad. Like,
Yeah, he's having a great little moment with his two
Yeah.
boys, but I think that is to emphasize the irony, right? That
Yeah.
at home, maybe he is a loving father and a great husband. Who knows? But that is the snapshot that Billy Wilder wants to paint, because we know that who he really is away from home, he's the antithesis to that.
Yeah.
So I do love that little
Yeah.
juxtaposition there.
Yeah. So in a way, what Wilder is doing is showcasing the importance of the individual as opposed to the problem at hand. That maybe this is something that is imminent and not solvable, right? He's not trying to solve this issue. It's more so, how can these two people learn to recognize this overarching corporate issue, but still exist within it for the betterment of themselves?
Yeah.
And that's essentially what this is.
Yeah.
It's a movie about civic liberties in many ways, and I kind of appreciate that.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, we get that snapshot of who Sheldrick is at home, but we know him to be the sleazeball away from home. And yet when all of that dissolves, he just doesn't care to relish in any sort of heartbreak. There's no consequences to him. It's like, I'm moving on. I'm moving on
Yeah.
from my family and two sons to be with my mistress, like just like with a snap of a finger.
Yeah.
And again,
But
that's
it's almost like he takes joy in that because he didn't have to make the action himself.
which again, I think speaks to that duality in the commentary that we're talking about. By making that decision, it from a thematic standpoint is like, wow, this is what he's saying about corporate America.
Sure.
And but on the same token, from just the simple movie perspective, it's such a fascinating choice as well.
Yeah.
It just kind of maintains the levity of the movie, and it's really great. And of course, it emphasizes Fran's decision there at the end when she leaves him as well.
Yeah.
So again, like, I love how the film is able to have its cake and eat it too. And the other thing too about it that I think is really great too, is with what you're saying about the ending of this film. I do think that Wilder is being subversive to old Hollywood here on purpose.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
the reason I say that is I think it is kind of funny how meta this film is regarding old Hollywood, because so many films in old Hollywood prominently featured and often encouraged cheating and infidelity. Which makes sense when you learn about old Hollywood and the sleazy things that were happening back then. It was not great.
This
wasn't
does
great.
seem, it does seem like a very Bill Wilder thing to do, because many of his films were kind of deconstructionistic in a way,
Yes.
about the tropes of Hollywood at the time, whether it be about film noirs with a movie like Sunset Boulevard, or or a movie like Some Like It Hot certainly has some of those same elements about
Yeah.
the difference between masculinity and femininity and the crossing of those
Mm-hmm.
separate lines. And here, I think he's doing the same thing by deconstructing that very notion that you're talking about, but also deconstructing the idea that just because this is still a romance movie doesn't necessarily mean the couple, quote unquote, gets together in the traditional sense. And I
Well,
think you
and
can
that's-
argue that too.
Yeah, that's ultimately what I was trying to build toward, is that this is a film that wants to comment on those old tropes and how romances have been depicted, again, with infidelity built right into the DNA of a lot of those romances, which is what makes the I'm going to break up that marriage thing we brought up earlier so funny. Like, so funny. Like, I easily thought about the best years of our lives here as well. And so, yeah, the way this film ends, it is a commentary on Hollywood itself as much as it is America, and it doesn't want to engage romantically in the same ways a lot of those movies did. And it is a bit anticlimactic. Perhaps you can infer that they do get together and maybe they get married. Who knows?
I don't
But
know.
I love
Like,
that it's kind of
yeah.
left up in the air a little bit.
If someone wants to make the argument that their relationship is strictly but platonic, I don't think that's a unfair assessment. I think there is evidence to support that potential direction as well.
I agree. I mean, I think it's like the way Wilder ends this, it's probably fair to say that they at least give it a try, but knowing those two characters and who they are and their histories, I don't think there's anything to suggest that could last either. Like I
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
who's to say, but like, I love the buildup of it though, because obviously Bud is head over heels for Fran, but
Mhm,
it takes up until the last second for Fran to kind of reciprocate that.
mhm.
And so, which is why I love that it ends with them just playing cards. Again, there's a
Yeah.
poetry
It's a
to
simple
that, going back
gesture.
to the
Yeah.
writing. It's a great gesture, and it circles back to that endearing moment of them, kind of, playing cards right after
It's
she's,
yeah, yeah.
recovering from her issue.
Wilder recognizes that he's probably sitting there thinking that every other Hollywood movie would end with them kissing or maybe even having sex, or at least alluding to the fact that they're about to do that. Whereas here he's thinking like any normal person who went through this situation is not going to immediately embrace each other in that way.
Yeah,
Let's keep this grounded. Let's keep it
yeah,
real. And he
yeah.
absolutely does.
Like, speaking of sex, though, one of my favorite lines of dialogue in the film is when she's still over at the apartment and
Hmm.
her sister's husband is on the way to find Bud, but he
Oh
doesn't know
yeah,
this.
yeah.
He doesn't know this. We, as the audience, are aware, but he doesn't know. And he's trying to get her to play the game again.
Hmm.
And he says something to the effect of, "Yeah, we could. You remember we can play that game, and I won't take advantage of you like the last time when we were in bed or something like that." And he's talking innocently about a card game, but he
I
says
know
that
it's
as he
yeah.
opens the door, that's what the guy hears. It's just good. It's
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah. It's like he probably walks in. What is this perverted form of role play you guys are talking about?
Yeah, it's just the best. Like I love it. I mean, and that's this film, entertainment wise, is quite good. It's very good.
It's all encompassing. I feel like in many ways it represents everything that Billy Wilder was so great at. That's why I think it might be his best film. Like I said in the opening of this conversation, I feel like it's either between this or Double Indemnity are the two that I tend to cite as my favorites. But I mean, he's got a lot of classics under his belt. I do like The Apartment more than Some Like It Hot. I like it more than Sunset Boulevard. Sabrina, I haven't seen in quite some time, but I know I like it more than that one. The Lost Weekend, I think, is also a very good film. I like this more
Which,
than that as
speaking
well.
of, did you catch the Lost Weekend reference in the film?
I don't think I did. You
Yeah,
might have to educate me on that one.
there's a line where, and I forget, it might have been the Al character. I think so. Yeah, this is because it's him and another one of the managers are in Bud's office,
Hmm.
and they're speaking about what he saw because he saw Fran on the bed, so he thinks
Yeah.
that Fran and Bud are kind of in cahoots or whatever.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
And he says something about like them having a tout at the apartment, and he's like, a tout? It was more like a lost weekend. That's what
Oh,
he
okay.
says.
Yeah, you're right. It was so subtle. I didn't even pick up on that.
Yeah.
It just felt like natural conversation.
Yeah.
I thought you were about. I thought you were
Yeah.
about to say that the bartender at one of the bars was played by the same bartender in The Lost Weekend, as if
No,
like
no, no.
Billy Wilder
Which
was
that
building
would be
his own
fun, too.
cinematic universe or something.
Maybe. But that was definitely the Leo pointing at the TV moment. I was like, I see what you did there. I see
Oh,
what you
okay.
did there.
That's clever. That's clever. That was a
Anyway,
good
sorry,
movie.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I do
but I
like The
thought that was
Lost
funny
Weekend quite a
moment.
bit. Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely one of the better Billy Wilder films that I have seen. But this, yeah, I think as we round out this conversation, it probably is my favorite Billy Wilder film. The Apartment is.
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, as you noted, he has several masterpieces here, some all-time movies. I
Hmm.
love Double Indemnity as well. That's probably my 1B here.
Hmm.
Sunset
Same.
Boulevard is another classic of his as well. One of his most underrated, I think, is Ace in the Hole. I think that film
That's
is a masterpiece.
that's probably my number three, actually.
Yeah,
Like, if I were to do my top three Billy Wilder films up until
I
this
think I'm
point,
right there
it's
with
The
you. Yeah.
Apartment, Double Indemnity, and Ace in the Hole. And I do, I recognize that movies like Some Like It Hot and Sunset Boulevard are classics for a reason. I don't fully love those films to warrant calling them one of my all-time favorites. I think they're all great, but I think they have some things in them that, respectively, I don't love. Some from a storytelling angle, I don't think they're perfect
Mhm.
movies. But I think those other three that we referenced there are just more provocative and more realized productions. I think there's more
Mhm.
more going on there seamlessly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I think Ace in the Hole, and again, I think it's just because it's another one of those movies that is like The Apartment in the sense that it's very entertaining. There is an
Hmm.
entertaining angle to that film, but thematically, man, that's a hefty movie
I agree.
and a film that very, very much holds up today as well.
Hmm.
So I love Ace in the Hole. That's certainly a top three Wilder film for me as well. But yeah, I love Some Like It Hot, all time classic movie for sure.
Hmm.
Sunset Boulevard is great. The 7 Year Itch is another well known of
It's a
his.
very entertaining one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
entertaining. So yeah, I mean, the man was very good at his job.
He was.
Very
Yeah.
good.
He did good
Very good at his
things.
job.
Did good
Did
things.
did did good things. Um, but yes, I think The Apartment is my favorite of his. I think it is.
Yeah. And honestly, looking at these other films that we're going to be talking about in this series, all of which won Best Picture in the 1960s, we're off to a good start. I think we're off to a very good start.
We're off to a good start. Now, some of these films I haven't seen in a while, so it's hard to say fully where this will land for me when it's all said and done, when we get through all 10 of them.
Hmm.
But given how I feel about all of these films in the moment, it's very possible that once we get through this decade, that The Apartment, if it's not my favorite of this crop, at worst it'll be number two.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not ready to say whether it's my favorite of these 10 films we're about to talk about. Um, but I think it might be. Honestly, there are
Mm.
two films here that could give it a run for its money for me. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, we have to revisit them to see how we feel about them now in context of this movie series. But one of them is Lawrence of Arabia. Uh,
100%. Yep.
the other one is Midnight Cowboy.
Yep.
Those are the two that I'm thinking could potentially give it a run for its money. But I wouldn't be surprised by the end of this series, those end up
Yeah.
being my top three of the Best
Yeah.
Picture winners.
And Midnight Cowboy is the one that I'm looking forward to the most with that specific conversation in mind because
Hmm.
I do love it. At this point, I would probably slightly take The Apartment over it.
Hmm.
Lawrence of Arabia, though, that's a different story altogether.
Yeah.
That one
Yeah.
could easily overtake The Apartment once we get through it
Hmm.
because I have really changed my tune. If you asked me that a couple of years ago, Lawrence of Arabia would have been low on my list here. But that's changed. And I think Lawrence of Arabia could easily take that number one spot when it's all said and done
Sure.
of this decade. But The Apartment is going to be in the conversation
Hmm.
and likely at worst will be number two for me. But we'll see once we get to Midnight Cowboy. I am very much looking forward to that rewatch. It's been
Yeah.
quite a few years for me. So,
Yeah. I do love that film.
any final thoughts as we wind down here?
Good movie. The Apartment. Good movie.
Good
Movies are
movie.
good.
Yeah, movies are good. Really do love this film a lot, and I cannot wait to see where the rest of the series goes. If you
Absolutely.
agree or disagree with anything we had to say, please leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, all that fun stuff. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can hit us up on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Letterboxd. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com as well. But we would definitely love to hear from you.